Welcome to AI Month 2023. My name is Petra Vorsteher, co-founder of AI.HAMBURG, and I have the great pleasure to welcome you to an exciting day with 7 amazing panels and 23 expert speakers. The next session tackles a big problem, climate change. We will have a fireside chat that will talk about carbon markets and AI. And with this, I will pass it on to our moderator, Tobias Straube. Take it ahead.
Thank you so much, Petra. Hello, everyone, also from my side. My name is Tobias Straube. I am the Associate Partner and VP for Analysis at the Berkeley-based geotech think tank Cambrian. And as Petra already mentioned, I will be moderating this next session. So what are we going to do? In the next 45 minutes, we will look at carbon markets, their role in the fight against climate change, and the potential of AI to make this mechanism a bit more effective. For some of you, the word carbon market is probably new. Essentially, they are systems where companies or individuals like you and me can buy and sell permits that allow us to emit or offset a certain amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You're probably familiar with this from booking an airline ticket. Most airlines offer you to pay a premium price shortly before the lockout or when you do the payment in exchange for the promise to offset the emissions caused by the flight. They do this by buying so-called carbon credits from projects like trees, people that are planting trees or something else to remove the emissions from the atmosphere. That's at least an example of voluntary carbon markets. But much more appropriate to talk about the topic is my guest today, Dr. David Pervan. David is an environmental engineer, Y Combinator alum, and serial entrepreneur and investor. He's currently based in San Diego, California, and will kick us off with a short keynote presentation to baseline us on carbon markets. Afterwards, we will dive a bit into the subject and have a Q&A. Against that background, I also want to invite everyone to ask the questions in the chat so I can pick them up right after the presentation. Having said all of that, David, over to you, and I'm looking forward to the keynote.
Thank you so much, Tobias. Thank you so much, Petra. Good afternoon to Europe. Good morning here. I'm going to share my screen and go over to my presentation. Okay, I hope you can see it. Today's session, as Tobias said, is about carbon markets and AI and the role that AI can play to fight climate change, which is an area that I'm very passionate about. So quick background on myself. I have a background in chemical engineering and environmental engineering. The top right is me in my fabulous lab days of working on 3D printing with metal nanoparticles. After my time in academia, I got into entrepreneurship and started a bunch of companies. And so a lot of them were climate themed. One of them was on Bayesian optimization of solid state batteries for electric cars. There's a Costa Rican eco-village. But I think most relevant for this is several blue carbon projects that I worked on. So the bottom left is was a project in the Bahamas, a mangrove reforestation project, another project on food waste diversion from landfill to obtain methane credits for diverting methane from landfill. So this is the bagels in the bottom right. And I'm an investor in Pioneer Fund, among a few other jobs that I have. So maybe I want to take you back to the fall of 2020. So this is at the height of the pandemic, COVID pandemic. I lived in San Francisco in the Bay Area. And this picture is not edited. This is real. So what happened, and I remember this day very well, it was the 9th of September, woke up in the morning. It was kind of a little bit dark outside, never really got bright, and I was, it was like 9 a.m. and I was like, it's still pretty dark outside. This is kind of weird. And suddenly around from maybe 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., the entire sky turned orange, exactly as you see in this picture. Here's another picture of the skyline of San Francisco, again, unedited. So what was happening was there was a tremendous amount of wildfires in the area, or not just in the area, on the west coast of the US. And where the smoke from the wildfires goes is really unpredictable. It's a matter of winds and I guess like thermal vents. And it just so happened that the wind conditions changed, and basically the whole Bay Area was filled with wildfire smoke. And suddenly during, basically, I mean, this phenomena that I'd seen before, that you can only see maybe, I don't know, visibility like 50 to 100 meters, but suddenly with the sunlight coming in on this particular day, it turned the whole sky orange. And this is actually, like, people refer to it nowadays as the Orange Day. Was actually, I think, a really pivotal moment, certainly in the Bay Area, in really focusing people on climate change and thinking about it. So obviously, Bay Area being, the main hub for innovation and technology, probably in the last 2 decades, suddenly people kind of felt, this is a very existential thing. Air you take for granted as much as probably more than anything in the world. And so really a tremendous amount of companies were started as an experience of having gone through this personally. A lot of investors suddenly became interested in the space and investing into it. And it was also, for me, a very stark reminder of the significance of really, applying ourselves to this, and AI coming primarily, or, a lot of the technologies coming out of the Bay Area. It was a wake-up call for many people. So this is just a bit of a personal story of one of the days that certainly shaped the industry here to focus on AI, also myself, I would say, included. And so, okay, I'm going to give you a introduction into the carbon markets, just to get everyone on the same to the same level of understanding, because this is obviously an AI conference primarily, and so carbon markets are somewhat adjacent. So what are carbon markets? Carbon markets emerged out of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And basically the initial idea was to create a mechanism that can be used to trade carbon emissions, with the ultimate goal of incentivizing carbon emission reduction. From the very start, there was an equity aspect where, we started to understand climate change much more. And, there was obviously an understanding that high-income countries, industrialized countries, have produced historically the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions, while low-income countries really bear the burden of the impact. And so there was already at that point an equity idea of channeling money from high-income countries to low-income countries. But really, primarily, it's a form of trading a carbon emission, essentially giving a price tag to a carbon emission. There's a very basic concept that people often refer to, which is, right now, if you're a landowner in somewhere, let's say in a tropical part of the world, and you own the land, well, if you cut down the trees, you make significant money of it. If you don't cut down the trees, you don't, right? So there is kind of an economic imbalance of the monetization of ecosystems, where you don't have a revenue stream necessarily from protecting and preserving nature. And so this was kind of the founding ideas, how carbon markets got started. Initially, it was literally like a physical document, like in the top right. Now, most of it is electronic. So basically, you can summarize 2 kinds of carbon markets. One of them is the mandatory carbon market in the compliance space. This is the one that first emerged out of the Kyoto Protocol. which is regulated by governments and supranational entities. So in the European Union is the it's the ETF, the Emissions Trading System. In the US, it's the RGGI. Essentially, the way they work is governments give emission limits to industries, and if a particular company goes above those emission limits, they need to purchase the right to emit more greenhouse gases, which is a carbon credit. If a company, on the other hand, through I don't know, upgrading their systems to a lower carbon manufacturing way or whatever, are able to go to get below this emission rate that they're allowed to, they can then sell the credits that they didn't use to other players in the market. And so essentially it creates a financial incentive to change, to get some of these industries, and this particularly for highly emitting industries, to change to lower carbon methods, and to essentially give a price tag again to the emission of CO2 or other greenhouse gases. The voluntary space emerged in the last 2 decades only. I mean, in the 2000s, and the voluntary space is different in that it's not regulated by government, and it basically gives it's a market for carbon credits for people, individuals, groups of people, countries, institutions, organizations who would like to offset their greenhouse gas emissions. It's not, the crucial point here is it's not regulated by government. So it's regulated just by whoever issues the credit, essentially. That space has grown a lot. The demand of it is really exploding in the last few years, with increasing companies, saying they want to reach net zero emissions, which we'll get into a little bit later. So this is where they would go to purchase credit in the voluntary space. So I want to make this point, which I think is really important and often overlooked, about offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. When we talk about the carbon markets, we talk about trading emissions, essentially one organization trading an emission with another organization. And I think a really key aspect of really decarbonizing the economy is to think about and not to forget about insetting. So what does that mean? Insetting means, as an organization or as an individual person, you look at your own organization to remove carbon emissions. And so that can be, improving energy efficiency of the processes you're using, transitioning to different types of energy sources like renewable energies, reducing your waste, reducing your travel. That is, what from an environmental perspective is really encouraged, first of all, is the insetting, meaning looking internally to reduce emissions. The idea of offsetting is basically that a company is not going to be able to entirely remove internal emissions, and so is required for the emissions that it cannot offset internally, it essentially should pay for projects outside of its realm to neutralize the emissions that are still remaining. So one of the really good examples of this is all the US major airlines have committed to being so-called carbon neutral by more or less most of them 2030. So an airline, in the absence of fully electric planes, which they don't look like they will happen in the next few years, there's only so much insetting the airline can do because the vast majority of their emissions comes from flying the planes. And so their only way to claim carbon neutrality or net zero carbon emissions is by offsetting basically huge amounts of greenhouse gases. And so this is where we are in the offsetting territory, and what fuels a lot of the demand in it. yeah, an area that's grown a lot. So there are different types of carbon offsets. I would classify two different categories. One is technology-based. So these are essentially technology upgrades, which are less carbon intensive. So that can be renewable energy, energy efficiency projects, methane capturing and utilization. So for example, flaring of methane, where if you burn a molecule of methane, it suddenly is, 28 times less global warming, has a smaller global warming effect. Fuel switching. So that's one type of or category of carbon offsets, carbon credits. The other one is nature-based. So, it is obviously understood that nature, is a massive carbon sink. So takes up carbon from the atmosphere and essentially deposits it in the soil. And so nature-based projects essentially mean you finance a project which can consist of many different things. So it can be afforestation, meaning planting trees in an area where there were no trees previously, reforestation, which is planting trees in a cut down forest, forest management, which can be reducing illegal cutting of trees, restoration, conservation, where, basically the idea is, to estimate the amount of carbon that is stored or reduced emissions. So this is like the preventing of cutting down a forest, for example, which would emit a lot of carbon. So if you prevent that from happening, you essentially can claim carbon credits for it. I'll get into that a little bit more further on. I want to move on to the critique of carbon markets, because this is I guess this will lead into how AI can be used to solve some of these issues. So carbon markets have been in the news, especially in the last few years, quite a lot. And I want to kind of talk about a little bit about one article published by The Guardian that created a lot of attention. It was in January this year that it came out, and basically claimed that there was sort of an investigation into a lot of the nature-based, specifically voluntary carbon credits projects by the biggest credit provider, which is called Vera, and found that 90% of them vastly inflate the carbon credits from these projects, meaning they, as this article claims, so you can see in the figure on the left, basically these projects claimed 95 million carbon credits and actually the real emissions that occurred from these projects is only around 5.5 million. So a huge, obviously, disparity claimed there. This, by the way, I should have mentioned this before, one carbon credit represents 1 ton of CO2. And so how this article was, created a lot of controversy and really put into doubt, I would say, the entire space of voluntary carbon credits, specifically nature-based ones. And I'll get a little bit into why and what are the inherent problematic aspects about nature-based carbon credits projects. So one of the main ones is that carbon credits projects, the way they work is that they're based on this notion of what's called additionality, which means you cannot claim carbon credits for a project that would have occurred anyway. So as an example, if you have a piece of land like a forest, and that forest continuously draws carbon from the atmosphere and ultimately stores it in the soil, that's a process that would have happened anyway. You need to design a project where the claim is, if this project wouldn't have happened, or basically because of the project happening, so much more carbon was stored. And so an example of this would be preventing illegal cutting down from trees. If there's a continual cutting down from trees, you create what's called a baseline scenario, which is this would have happened without a project, which is the illegal cutting down of trees would have continued, as an example. But because of this project and us basically preventing all of this cutting down of trees, this many trees won't be cut down. And for this delta, for this difference, this what's called additionality, you receive carbon credits. And so this is, and like, I guess maybe I don't have the time to go into all the details of this, but just to touch on it briefly, what's really problematic here is essentially you make a claim for what's called a counterfactual, which is a scenario which ultimately you can't test. So you create a baseline, which is essentially a prediction of the future against which, and so the difference between that and the real outcome is the amount of credits. And so how do you create these baseline scenarios becomes really important. And so just as an example here from this Guardian article, the reference area that was used for this baseline scenario is, for example, closer to roads and closer to towns where a lot of basically cutting down of trees occurs much more frequently than in the project area. So if you use the reference area as your baseline scenario, but they're not comparable in terms of geographies and reasons why people cut trees, it's probably not accurate, and you're claiming credits that actually don't make sense. So there wasn't the net climate effect that one would hope for. Briefly, a few other critiques of carbon markets. This is a big one. So it's the scientific uncertainty of some of these ecosystems and our full understanding of how they actually work, specifically like, specific geographies. And so this is an example. Wetlands have become increasingly interesting for carbon projects because they actually store much more carbon than dry land. So wetlands meaning coastal areas, mangrove forests, seaweed, seagrass, which is the majority of the carbon projects that I worked with. So this is a scholarly article that was published a year ago, which basically showed that they actually measured the direct carbon fluxes of a mangrove forest in Florida, directly measuring it. And what they found is that the whole carbon system is impacted by a lot of different factors that influence carbon emission, essentially warming contribution of the ecosystem versus cooling. So like the emissions versus the sink. And, one of the various factors that influences this is in these wet systems is a process called calcification. I won't go into the details, but essentially the degree at which calcification, which contributes to warming and emission of CO2, actually occurs is a factor of salinity and water temperature. But what they found in this specific one was that this mangrove forest actually emitted around, so the emissions caused by the calcification in this ecosystem were about 20 times as big as the sequestration of the ecosystem. So what it means is actually, if this study is accurate, the net balance of this ecosystem is actually that it's contributing to global warming rather than global cooling. It's not actually sequestering. And so, this highlights, I guess, a few different, and this is not to say that all mangrove forests in the world, this applies to all of them. This is a very site-specific regional thing. And this is, I guess, one of the critiques is like, we have these models on how we understand these ecosystems that we use to base our calculations on. But actually, there's a lot of local regional factors that we can't factor in that have huge implications on the actual carbon balance of these ecosystems. And so, essentially, and if you're actually consequential about carbon credits, you could actually, in theory, almost imagine you could get carbon credits for cutting down this mangrove forest, because right now, as it stands, this specific one is actually emitting carbon. And here, you could essentially prevent carbon emissions by cutting it down. So, Another brief criticism I want to mention is that essentially like what I would call black swan events based on, the black swan kind of idea of Nicholas Nassim Taleb. When you in nature-based projects, basically multiple projects always get grouped together, and between 2 and 4% of the credits that are issued from these projects are left behind as an insurance policy. So this is in case something unprecedented happens, such as wildfires or disasters or natural catastrophes, diseases, illegal lodging, like unforeseeable events occur that actually destroy the ecosystem or emit carbon. And so one of the things that happened here in California is that there was a new forest scheme, which essentially was a credit structure for maintaining forests, and the pool of the insurance that was left aside for the next 100 years that was calculated for these unpredictable events was actually used up in the first 10 years because of wildfires. So wildfires here, were unprecedented in some of the last years. And so this is, again, like one of the difficulties of carbon credits is, well, what if you've issued already these credits, but now they're not actually accurate. They don't represent the reality of having contributed to global cooling, because so many of these forests that you were issued credits for have actually burnt down. And so another kind of problem here is just the unpredictable nature of these natural catastrophes and events that essentially mean in the end you have credits that are worth nothing. So a little bit of a summary of some of the critique. I mean, the main one is always that it's greenwashing. It basically allows entities to, rather than doing the more challenging thing, which is insetting, which I mentioned earlier, to actually reduce emissions, basically to outsource their emissions, and that also can have kind of a discouraging effect to actually change, because you have this easy way of buying emissions outside of the organization. So this is what people also call like creative accounting. You're not actually changing anything, but you're just like you're adding to your balance sheet a project outside of your perimeter, which might or might not be true. There's an ethical kind of critique of the general commodification of the environment. Why do we need to give a price tag to this? The accreditation process is really, as I said in the Vera article and some of the others, has really drawn most of the attention in terms of its critique. So the notion of additionality, which I explained, which is inherently impossible to prove because you can't have a real life AV scenario. Also, permanence is a big issue, which is often talked about. I won't go into it, but basically permanence means, how permanent is this sequestration actually? Because if you think about a lot of these nature-based, ecosystems, they transfer CO2 from the atmosphere into what's called the lithosphere, which is essentially the soil carbon. Well, that's actually still different from taking fossil fuels that are deep underground from geological layers and bringing it into the atmosphere, right? So there is an argument to be made that it's actually not as permanent. And so permanence is usually measured in thousands of years. So how do we know the soil won't be disturbed for the next, hundreds of years? And so all of this has led to, there was a recent study, 41% of chief sustainability officers do not use carbon offsets. And the main reason is trust. So this is some of the critique, and I'm overrunning a little bit, but I want to briefly touch on to AI and how this can be used. So AI is interesting and has been increasingly applied to the carbon markets. And I think for me, so there's predictive analysis of forecasting and emissions, optimization of internal ways to basically reduce emissions, carbon accounting and the transparency and the real-time aspect of those. The one that I have personally the most experience with, and I find also the most interesting, is the monitoring verification aspect of these carbon credits and of these projects, because this is really touches on the trust issue that I was speaking about just now. Essentially, and how are currently nature-based projects verified? A lot of it is through external, essentially consultants who get flown around the world to literally walk around forests and measure trees. And this is like, I mean, from a carbon balance perspective, it's bad. I mean, in these types of ecosystems, actually wet ones, every step you take, you're releasing methane because of the methane in the wet soil, but also it's inaccurate and it leads to a lot of distrust. And it's basically old technologies being used. And so I think one of the most interesting applications of AI in carbon markets is the use of innovative technology to actually quantify these ecosystems and what's called carbon stocks. So this is an example of a very cool project in New York, which was sort of a citizen science project. People were encouraged to use the LiDAR function of their phones to measure the carbon stocks of trees. And so, you know, if you imagine a lot of people participating and you match that with satellite images and the geolocations of where they are, suddenly then you can use machine learning and to essentially create correlations and basically like predictions on different trees and satellite images. And so the kind of like verification that we are moving towards, although there are some big barriers, is to use increasingly satellite images as well as LiDAR technology. LiDAR, you might have, yeah, anyway, it's, you know, what's used in electric cars to map the 3D environment, to measure these carbon stocks instead of people counting trees and measuring trees. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here because I've dramatically overrun.
I don't think you have overrun, but it's great to have a bit of time for discussions because that has been very rich in terms of information. And I must say, I'm every time surprised, right? You come across an approach, it sounds so perfect, right? It sounds to make so much sense. And then you start digging into the details and all of a sudden you realize, okay, even the best possible approaches really have a lot of devils in the detail and a lot of bottlenecks. And it made me kind of wondering, you know, I decided a couple of months ago to be carbon neutral with my own life. And in my name, there have been 387 trees planted so far. And now I'm learning that most of that is probably not even taking the emissions out of the air. So I feel kind of personally touched by it. Now, you've mentioned quite a bit of critiques, right? And when we talked about it before, we started also to realize it's still such a big market, right? It's not going to disappear. And it can actually contribute to the fight against the climate quite heavily. And now there are all the technologies where you've shown us, that you have shown us, right, that can help. So it makes me wonder, what kind of spaces do you see like for innovators and startups to tackle those challenges? Because what is critic on a system is an opportunity for someone else, right?
Yeah.
So if we see those shortcomings, there must be companies seeing that as opportunities. And what are kind of the trends that you're seeing out there, right? What are the use cases innovators are working on? Is it really prediction and verification? Well, what are the dynamics in the market?
Yeah, I totally agree, first of all, on the notion that where there's a lot of problems, there's a lot of opportunity for it to be solved. Because, you know, while there's a lot of skepticism in the market now, you know, on nature-based projects, still the demand has been increasing by 20–30% every year, and it's predicted to grow. So, like, voluntary carbon credits are not going anywhere, and there will be a demand for it for sure. I think the key aspect in the voluntary space is trust. The whole system is based on trust because it's not regulated. And so, you know, how can we provide trust to buyers that these projects are real and the climate impact is real? And I think it really comes down to the data and the transparency of that, right? So if you imagine a world where you have real-time access to a lot of these projects on what they're doing, not just on like an every few year basis where people do carbon stocks, as I said, manually, but actually you use technology that's out there and available. And a lot of it is open source, right? Like not just the code base for some of the AI, but also, you know, the majority of satellite images that are used, you know, Sentinel is one of the big ones provided by the EU, which basically takes pictures, you know, continuously of the entire globe. Like every 2 days, you can get pictures of every location. So the data is there, but so we basically, I think the innovation space right now is on like capturing the data and analyzing it and making sense of the carbon stocks and quantifying those. I want to say one thing though, which is in some way, the innovation right now at times is blocked by the verification bodies, because the verification bodies, the methodologies on how they verify these carbon credits is ultimately what determines how, like, essentially the official carbon credits are issued and how many of those. And so if their process and methodology essentially says, well, you need to send people there on the ground to like count trees, there's not so much you can do if you're operating within the realm of this methodology. And so I think there's potential for using faster, technologies in AI and data analysis, which, can quantify much larger areas much faster than we can. But it also needs to be reflected in the methodologies. Either the current ones need to be adapted, which is slowly happening to enable this type of new technology to be used, or entirely new methodologies need to be created even by new bodies. Yeah.
That makes perfect sense. So you're saying verification and transparency is key in order to ensure that there's trust in the market. So AI helps us to get that transparency and the verification right, so that the markets can continue to exist. Now, on the other hand, there are carbon projects, right? And you touched upon the differences between nature-based project and technology-based project. And I also want to loop in here a question that Christian Butzlaff shared with me, and I think it's going somewhat in the same direction. He was asking, can you comment on carbon credits and RECs, which is a renewable energy credit, for those that are not familiar with the abbreviations. So do you see, what's the development on the carbon project side that actually issue the credits? Is there also potential for artificial intelligence and others?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier this difference between technology-based credits projects and nature-based ones. They have different verification methods, which makes sense because they're totally different in their claims on how they capture carbon. And a lot of times the technology-based ones are much easier to quantify and much easier to assess. So if you, which inherently makes sense. I would say there's been a trend in the last couple of, so there's been like two kind of conflicting trends. Initially, the vast majority of projects were technology-based ones, like renewable energy projects. And suddenly nature-based projects emerged as an alternative, and there was great support because of like essentially the added value of nature-based projects, which is this notion of like, don't just look at carbon and the avoidance of carbon emissions, but look at the greater ecosystem, right? So nature-based projects, if you preserve a forest, has all of these additional benefits and values, such as like biodiversity, right? Which we're preserving. So a lot of people kind of went on the train of nature-based projects are actually much better. We should preserve the environment, which has all of these added values. Now, nature-based projects have come into critique because of some of the aspects that I mentioned, that it's essentially scientifically very difficult to actually verify the amount that you're claiming to have reduced. So there's an interesting reemergence of technology-based projects, and specifically one I want to mention. Like the country of Switzerland has been purchasing and funding carbon credits for many decades, and took this decision a few years ago, which I think is symbolic, that because of the controversies of nature-based projects, they completely stopped funding those. And the only projects that are now funded by the Swiss government or like basically national Swiss entities are what's called direct air capture projects. So this is not renewable energy projects, but this is literally like a massive vacuum cleaner that sucks CO2 out of the air and captures it, because there's a notion that this is inherently, this is undoubtedly and unbiasedly, reducing CO2 in the atmosphere, and it wouldn't have happened otherwise. So this is going back to the additionality aspect of like, there's often, basically with every other type of credit, there's always the claim of like I guess one of the critique is always, this might have happened anyway, right? So if you like build solar cells or hydroelectric plants, well, that might have happened anyway, and you're just looking for a way to finance some of that. But if you're doing direct air capture, there's really no point other than drawing CO2, and you can measure really accurately how much you're drawing out. So this is kind of, and in that space, I think there are, in a way, like less, it's more quantifiable. We have technology to measure these kinds of things. In the nature base, there's a lot more space for innovation, but also in the technology space, some of the methodologies are updating now quite fast. And are enabling all kinds of new technologies to come online. So there's also space, I think, for AI to have an impact. And yeah, specifically in this direct air capture space, which has become really interesting for people who are sort of idealists about the trust aspect and being able to quantify the CO2 impact, and it wouldn't have happened otherwise, right? And that's certainly true about direct air capture.
That certainly convinces me. It seems like there are kind of two different quality of carbon credits, the trees that someone is planting for me in Panama, as it seems, and the carbon air capture that you can actually quantify that it's being sucked out of the air, because no one promises me that those rainforests in Paraguay and Panama will continue to be alive and out there for the foreseeable future. Now, one last question, probably on the market structure, because I think it's fascinating. So we're still rather early. You mentioned we are 2 decades into carbon markets, but it still seems very fragmented. It still seems a lot of players, a lot of different approaches, right? There is no unified marketplace, at least not one that we have come across, right? It's very much private trading, one-on-one trading. I think we call that over-the-counter trading. Do you see platform business models emerging, real marketplaces emerging, let's say in Amazon, but for carbon credits? Is that something that we'll see in the future?
Yeah, I think it will happen. It makes sense because marketplaces have tend to gravitate towards one dominant one. There's a sort of, I think, often inevitable monopoly effect that occurs. Right now, I would say why it hasn't happened yet is not so much the lack of like a marketplace, but it's a few different things. So one of them is also just the lack of credits, right? So the demand is like far outweighing the supply of credits. And so, bigger companies that are actually looking to offset like very large amounts of emissions. I mean, a good example is some of the tech companies in the US, Apple, Amazon. They actually, they have completely moved away from buying credits on the open market. They finance carbon credits, basically give seed funding for carbon credits and claim all the future rights to all of the future credits. So this is like going up a step in the sort of value chain and production of carbon credits, because there's just not enough available. And this is a trend that has been increasing. So the future markets of carbon credits is actually super active right now, because the demand is increasing so much. There's not enough availability. And so, but yeah, I mean, there's a ton of business tools that have emerged in the last few years that help businesses to quantify and purchase these credits. I think on that side, this is the easier part of the general space, is like, how do you quantify the carbon emissions? But to actually connect it to viable credits which are out there and available is much harder. Yeah.
I would like to ask one very final question and ask you for a very brief answer. So we've talked a lot about challenges. We know about a lot of problems now, but also the potentials. What is your one key advice that you would give an innovator that wants to enter into that space and use artificial intelligence in order to make a difference?
Yeah, I would encourage people to be optimistic about this. As we said earlier, where there's a lot of problems, there's a lot of opportunity. And I think in this space, I mean, I highlighted this a few times, but really trust is the main issue here, and the main sort of potential succeeding factor of any project, of any verification method, of any marketplace. And so I think, how do you foster trust in this, in this type of environment? I think it's through transparency, it's through data transparency. There's interesting approaches coming out of essentially using Web3 technology for the transparency aspect of carbon and how it's traded and at what price and what does it represent. And the data aspect is a big one. As we have more and more data that's readily available, open source, to actually verify these types of ecosystems, it becomes almost just the new set of challenges emerges, which is essentially like communication, trust, open, transparency, doing it in an open source way. So I am excited and positive that there's a lot of space for innovation, and there will be new startups solving this space, because it's already a multi-billion-dollar market, and so it will continue to exist. It's just a matter of who's going to provide that trust and that verification that makes people trust the whole process. Yeah, I would encourage people to be optimistic about this. As we said earlier, where there's a lot of problems, there's a lot of opportunity. And I think in this space, I highlighted this a few times, but really trust is the main issue here and the main sort of potential succeeding factor of any project, of any verification method, of any marketplace. And so I think, how do you foster trust in this, in this type of environment? I think it's through transparency, it's through data transparency. There's interesting approaches coming out of essentially using Web3 technology for the transparency aspect of carbon and how it's traded and at what price and what does it represent. And the data aspect is a big one. As we have more and more data that's readily available, open source, to actually verify these types of ecosystems, it becomes almost just the new set of challenges emerges, which is essentially like communication, trust, open, transparency, doing it in an open source way. So I am excited and positive that there's a lot of space for innovation, and there will be new startups solving this space, because it's already a multi-billion-dollar market, and so it will continue to exist. It's just a matter of who's going to provide that trust and that verification that makes people trust the whole process.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. Thanks you so much for having been a part of the session. I'm pretty sure that people who are interested can reach out to you on LinkedIn and continue the conversation there. I'm certainly looking forward to continuing the conversation in the context of AI Hamburg or elsewhere. And yeah, thank you that you've been here. And over to you, Petra, for the final words.
Yes, thank you so much, David, for shining light on this very, very, very complex subject. And I'm sure this was not the last one that we talked, and looking forward to having another fireside chat very soon. And thanks again. And I like to advertise our next session. It's called Generative AI in the Retail Sector, Disrupting Existing Business Models. We will start at 5 o'clock, and I hope we will see you all there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.